there, everyone. Idiocracy is a stupid movie, but let's have a conversation about what that actually means. For a while now, people have asked me to do an analysis of Mike Judge's 2005 comedy sci-fi horror film Idiocracy. I wonder why. I'm sure it's merely because of the fact that I run a channel that is themed around media and disability theory, focused on a wacky therapist that worked with schizophrenic patients and not anything else going on in the world.
Yeah, sure. If
Hey,
I
Pam,
could...
could I just interrupt for
Sure.
1 second? Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein? This guy's been talked about for years. You're asking, we have Texas, we have this, we have all of the things. And are people still talking about this guy, this creep? That is unbelievable.
Yep. Anyways, this film seems to be brought up a lot whenever people talk about the failures of modernity. Idiocracy is a film about how in the distant future, the world is full of stupid people, and two people from the current era have to figure out how to not only survive, but to get home with a time machine. This world they find themselves in is completely chaotic, but also one that we can reflect upon and see ourselves in. It's easy to look at the world around us these days with people plugged into endless streams of meaningless, violent, and sexually charged entertainment, and see how that translates to the political chaos of the world currently. Everything reduced to spectacle, various homoeroticisms expressed transparently through news media. But what else is carried through the narrative of the film? The film doesn't just simply tell us that the future is stupid. To set the stage where all this insurmountable stupidity came from, the film weaves a narrative with what I would generously describe as unfortunate implications. Yeah, it's true. It's a eugenics movie.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Even the Wikipedia page makes note of this, a website that typically tries to stay more neutral on sensitive subjects in film reviews. This conclusion is unfortunately inevitable. The film takes considerable time to explain both how and why the transfer of bad genes through successive generations leads to this dystopian society. It forces a viewer who notices these tendencies to ask themselves, what implications does this have for the intent of the film? After all, the film's message, which it speaks out almost verbatim to its audience at the end of the film, is that we should be smart, curious, and try to think about the lives we are living beyond just mere consumption and hedonism. So it is only natural to ask questions and think about what scenario we've been presented here. By borrowing the ethical and aesthetic paradigms as constructed from racist theories of evolutionary biology, the film muddies its intended message by focusing on the wrong thing. Or, in other words, the aesthetic choices made by the theoretical ideas that the writers are referencing embed themselves with ethical relations found throughout the film that has consequences for how the film is interpreted by viewers. Before I dive too deep into the interesting stuff, though, I feel like I should offer my opinion of the film, since I think it will inform the later discussion. Please keep in mind that moving forward in this video, I will be discussing a lot of spoilers. Alright, now with that out of the way, Idiocracy is a stupid movie for stupid people. Honestly, outside of the climax scene, I found most of the film to be unbearable. The film would be a better movie if it was actually entertaining. The pacing works, but scenes are boring and uninteresting. The male lead, Joe, is not particularly interesting or notable outside of being very dense and annoying. The real problem is that the movie is incredibly offensive as a substitute for humor and good writing. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. Oh, I got the diagnosis on this Felix guy. Don't want to sound like a dick or nothing, but it says on your chart here that you're fucked up. You talk like a
What?
And your shit's all
Ready for action.
This is probably my fault for being a trans person focusing on disability politics on YouTube. But to be honest though, I think half the people saying this don't actually remember what 2005 actually felt like. You know, with the whole illegal invasion of Iraq that we were doing and shit. And the other half of the people saying this are washed up millennial and Gen X losers who are pissed off that they can't say the R word anymore. Which this movie says a lot. To be honest, the offensiveness itself doesn't really upset me that much, because at least within the context of the film, it makes sense. But this movie actually goes out of its way to be offensive in ways that make no sense. The future scenes being offensive makes total sense, because it's supposed to represent a world where all bets are off. However, I feel that the writers also just simply wanted to indulge in excessive offensiveness through how they are obsessively crude in the present. For example, at the beginning of the film, there is a scene where a white doctor comes into the room and literally shouts, It's shocking, not just because he just drops the N-word out of, literally fucking nowhere, but because there's absolutely no build-up to it. There's no racist bullshit side story about how he's into hip-hop music or whatever. It's just literally a white guy dropping a soft N-bomb within the first 10 minutes of the movie for no reason. It's shit like this that makes me believe that white people back then really just wanted to say the N-word all the time. However, in my opinion, it's not even the edgy humor, constant sex jokes, or random racist slurs that make the film so frustrating to watch. Most of these, at least, can be analyzed through the lens of sociology, disability, psychoanalysis, or even through a historical analysis to produce interesting perspectives to better understand why the comparison to this movie is constantly made. But it all falls apart with Rita, the sex worker who's transported in time alongside Joe. At the beginning of the film, it is explained that Joe is selected for a cryogenesis experiment because he is the most average man in the whole military. However, they also want to freeze a woman as well, but the army has no suitable candidates, and so they resort to a prostitute on the street. Rita is kidnapped by the government and offered her charges against her prostitution being dropped in exchange for her participating in a science experiment. However, by the time that she actually participates, it's clear that she was lied to about the nature of the experiment. To make things worse, the person involved with organizing the experiment was implicated alongside her pimp Upgrade, with a double D, in a massive sex trafficking scandal, which ultimately leads to the defunding of the project, and their cryogenic coffins not being checked for hundreds of years. Both Rita and Joe are put through an existential horror of unmanageable proportions. But Rita's story is poorly explored. Not only does it really minimize the sexual exploitation that she experiences, it doesn't really explore the full possibilities of her character relative to the intended plot. For one thing, it's not clear if she's supposed to be more intelligent or less intelligent than Joe. For a movie about stupid people, I would feel that this detail is, well, pretty important. It feels like the writers try to write her as being more sharp than Joe, like street smart kind of thing, with her constantly keeping up this lie about how she works as an artist to obscure her sex work from him. However, for some reason, she doesn't believe that they're actually 500 years in the future, despite all of the evidence to the fact. I find it hard to believe that anyone, yes, even prostitutes, apparently, would not notice the amount of poverty around them and the constant indication that they are in a different space with all these newspapers and TVs making reference to 2505. She still doesn't seem to recognize or acknowledge that they are in the future by late in the movie, to an extent that seems to reflect less a delusion or denial and more so just the writers not knowing what to do with her character. In fact, the way that she approaches prostitution in the future makes little sense from a writing perspective. She just scams people, stealing their money while offering sex and thinking that she can get away with this. I think something that could have made her character a lot more interesting would be her recognizing that she's in 2505 and realizing that she is no longer in a relationship with her pimp. And therefore, she has a new set of relations to construct between her, her body, and her sex work. Instead, the film writes no real depth into her character, and she's just treated as a petty scoundrel through most of the film who eventually has a change of heart. There's a scene at the end of the movie where she feels bad for Joe possibly dying, even though she found him annoying throughout the film. I mean, he was pretty fucking annoying. Particularly frustrating in that, of course, they fall in love. Yeah, and they have an ideal heterosexual family together. Because of course they do. They can't help but reinforce the vision of evolution through family by rehabilitating her image into that of a mother. The image of evolution that was incredibly popular at the time, the same year of the release of The God Delusion. And this is contrasted with the bad reproduction of the stupid people in the future. Overall, her character is just frustrating, and while she has some good moments, I just think she really demonstrates the core of what is inherently wrong with this film. Idiocracy is a movie that tries to explain to its audience why it's stupid to be stupid, why being stupid now leads to a future of exponentially worse stupidity, with a movie that is inherently very stupid and shallow in of itself. I find it incredibly ironic that a movie that is trying to convince us all to not overindulge in hedonistic, overly violent, and sexual lifestyles that reinforce the surveillance and power of the state do so in such a way that embraces each and every one of these values through the core concepts of its writing. Idiocracy is this frustratingly stupid movie that feels like one of the people from the future trying to explain to one of his own people why being stupid is maybe not a good idea or whatever. There is too little valuable commentary because much like the discourse in popular film running in the United States in the 2000s, it was not concerned about a thought-provoking discussion that challenged both the boundaries of political norms and international impacts of the United States, but rather a continued pattern of indulgence through violence, the one distributed both on its own people and internationally through illegal wars of terror. At its core, Idiocracy is just another liberal warning us not to vote wrong in the future, and the commentary that is being produced around it is actually a more complex assemblage between the viewer and the content of the film. With my opinion out of the way, I think we really need to analyze something more interesting about the film, its intersection with disability, stupidity, evolution, and mass consumerism. This junction is the crux of what makes people have such a disconnect between the quality of the film and its supposedly deep messaging that keeps being brought up over and over again. To better grasp this, we really need to think about how stupidity is represented in the film. Many disabled-oriented critics of the film point out that the depiction of stupid people in this film is offensive because it is very similar to people with mental disabilities. Indeed, part of what makes the film so uncomfortable is that most of the characters in the future don't seem merely stupid. They seem genuinely intellectually disabled and struggle with understanding many basic things. It really is as if most of the population is afflicted with severe cognitive disability and that they are helpless to make the world a better place for themselves because they literally cannot conceive on how to improve it. An incredibly degrading way to view someone with cognitive disabilities. The depiction of these characters made me feel somewhat uncomfortable when confronting my own disability. See, something that's not often talked about with psychotic disorder is the cognitive impact caused by an episode. Some people make a nearly full recovery. I didn't fully recover. Even 4 years after my worst episode, I still have a lot of faculty that I've lost. Some of it is what you'd expect from someone who's recovered from psychosis. Things like, disturbance in thought and hallucinations. But frankly, these things are manageable. For me, the most debilitating disability has been the impact to my memory and my perception. When I was crazy, I was so disturbed that I was confused all the time, and basic architecture made me get lost. It was like having dementia. Now that I've mostly recovered, I still struggle with the symptoms. I was always somebody who was a bit lost in my own world, but it's progressed to a point where my obliviousness can pose a threat to my actual existence. I think of an instance when I was in Montreal, where I almost walked into high-speed traffic, completely unaware of the cars around me. And this is not the only time this has happened. Imagine the horror in knowing that your life could end because you cannot even perceive your own environment sufficiently. Is this really stupidity? I don't personally think so, but the film does not seem to really make a distinction. Where would such a line be drawn anyway? When does disability become stupidity? Despite this, I wouldn't go as far as to say the film is completely unaware of the complications of what stupidity is. While Rita's character is poorly written, Joe is consistent with his average intelligence, and offers an interesting exception to the film's apparent concept of stupidity. Throughout the film, he is claimed to be the most intelligent person in the world, because he scored higher on an IQ test than anyone else has in hundreds of years. However, he repeatedly demonstrates incredibly unintelligent behavior, which leads to him being captured by the cops, not being able to tell that Rita is a prostitute, and constantly being unable to read the situation and deal effectively with challenges being presented before him. In fact, it's arguably because of Joe's own stupidity that leads to much of the film's progression, part of what can make it so frustrating to watch. This leads to a different kind of stupidity emerging in the plot, a kind of stupidity that acts completely independently of diagnosed cognitive or congenital illness, one that Frito, one of the future inhabitants, points out at the end of the movie. For the smartest guy in the world, you're pretty dumb sometimes. Stupidity in this film clearly does not stop at just individuals merely being mentally disabled. There also exists a stupid society, one that doesn't just merely persist, but is actively mass-producing machines that suppress independent thought at every second to continually reproduce stupidity. Instead of these machines being futuristic robot police cops, they're actually systems of systemic power that persist through people's attitudes towards reading, thinking, and intelligence. A reactionary subcurrent drives through all of the people in this society, one that causes people to crave violence and constantly make objectifying sexual jokes, a constant reinforcement of the heterosexual surface value hedonism and the exclusion of all other things as gay, evident through the film with such lines such as, "Your shit's all fucked up and you talk like a fag," or using demeaning gestures. Stupidity is not just a single function, but rather a subject that coalesces at the interface of many things, coming together to reproduce itself. What truly makes this depiction offensive, then, is not so much the subject of making a film about stupidity itself, but rather the equivalence the film asserts between various aspects of what is described as stupidity, as if they're all interchangeable parts. Do these portrayals of reactionary stupidity as a kind of mental deficit even provide value to the film's narrative? Or is it just a cheap semiotic trick to try to communicate stupidity to a stupid audience? On top of this, I don't even believe that cognitive disability is even what produces this stupidity in the first place. This equivalence of complex apparatuses that actually composes the Idiocracy society is what ends up producing eugenicist narratives that the film is so often criticized for. To analyze how the film produces the concept of stupidity, it's important to analyze how it was said to have proliferated so widely. In the beginning of the film, it is explained that the continual decrease of intelligence of the overall population is genetic. To represent intelligence, it has to construct the image of an intelligent lineage and an unintelligent lineage in comparison. This creation of difference, a kind of binary sorting unit, allows for the movie's narrative about how intelligence dropped in society to make any sense. We can analyze this comparison through two important lenses that are created at the junction of this binary machine. First, the signifiers that are produced audiovisually, not just through language, but through motion, contrast, and other lenses. And second, the subjects produced by the interaction itself. Looking at the arrangement of signifiers, what we see is that the intelligent side is represented by things such as an affluent family with a fancy house that takes years to conceive of a child. The tone and shot is tidy, organized, and static, with little to no expression from the characters. Likewise, the diagram representing their genetic tree is quiet and unobtrusive. Contrast this to the unintelligent folk where chaos is everywhere. Everyone's running, screaming, and regretful decisions are being made at every other corner. The unintelligent characters aren't even really so much unintelligent as reckless. Perhaps the most upsettingly is the subtle but consistent classism, where a strong association between intelligence, responsibility, and access to capital are heavily implied. So what actually makes them intelligent or unintelligent? Well, for one thing, these signifiers need a place to stick onto, or otherwise they're just floating around in a meaningless ether. So at the same time that all these signifiers are floating around, they're being sucked into black holes. Yeah, black holes. I know that sounds weird, but hear me out. They aren't necessarily gravitational black holes that collapse at like a gravitational singularity, but instead they're functions like attractors within these semiotic spaces and collapse whatever comes too close into itself. These black holes absorb the signifiers that are too close to them. So we can imagine all the signifiers that are flying around the intelligent family, and they collapse in after being sucked into the black hole that produces the subject of that family. Thanks to these two things working together, the binary system that allows us to determine identifies for us who is good and who is bad here. This concept is called faciality and is discussed by French philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in more detail in 1,000 Plateaus in the plateau called Year Zero Faciality. But that book is really difficult and might be outside the average viewer's reading level. But I think I can explain the basics.
Minor clarification before I continue. Technically, Deleuze and Guattari's theory concerns a signifying semiotics. That means technically they are interested in what is in between the lines, not the words themselves. To try to explain what the white wall is a little better to newcomers though, I refer to it having signifiers, even though technically it is more a surface of significance where signifiers are possible. Sorry for the possible confusion.
The isotope hit quarter life and the room will slowly become vaporized.
So, you know those signifiers I was talking about? Those produce a sort of white wall of signifiance, a surface with all those signifiers on it that can have them concentrate around a subject that absorbs them into these black holes that capture and coalesce all these details inside of it. And this process produces what Deleuze and Guattari called the Faciality Machine. This machine is important because it's not just what tells us what an X or a Y is, but it also groups together a whole assemblage of complex systems into a binary format to make this determination. It's what allows for the production of a cinema that helps the audience figure out exactly what Mike Judge thinks stupid is. It's not just something described in words, but through a series of these images, the viewer concludes a binary about how the world is. And it's not merely just intelligence versus unintelligence, but what is good and bad for the very future of the human race. But let's get real. This relationship is doubtful. For one thing, the film takes place 500 years in the future. That's not really a long amount of time. North America started being colonized by the Europeans more than 500 years ago. In fact, let's think about our own ancestors for a second. In 100 years, we may have 3 to 5 generations of people. In the fastest case scenario, that means there's probably only about 25 generations between now and the future hell world. Considering that even in rapidly reproducing species, such complex changes do not develop this rapidly, it's quite unbelievable that the future is stupid merely because of cognitive disability, even if this is the future that Judge proposes. Is this really because of genetics? Or have we been fooled by a cinematic framing device, one that focuses on the faces of these subjects in its eye? As it turns out, the analysis of man's intelligence and its relationship to class is a question that has been pondered by the great scientists for centuries. However, this analysis would not just be as simple as measuring an association between signs and subjects. As Stephen Jay Gould points out in his excellent book, The Mismeasure of Man, the history of measuring intelligence has been a practice wrought with hidden biases and exceptions, framing devices that transform how the data is actually interpreted. To him, scientists do not even realize that they are peddling racist nonsense when repeating statistics about brain sizes, IQ tests, and problematic behaviors, and stresses that the problem has persisted throughout the history of the field. For some reason, scientists just keep reproducing racist, classist assumptions and use data to align it. Of course, this gladiatorial approach to evolution was not the only one. In a short essay written by Gould titled "Kropotkin Was No Crackpot," he discusses Peter Kropotkin, a Russian anarchist. Kropotkin wrote a book called Mutual Aid, where he attempts to interweave his own perspective on biology and evolution with political theory. To most trained in Western science, Kropotkin's perspective is hopeful but naive. However, Gould points out that Kropotkin's work did not exist in a vacuum. Darwin had a massive impact on Russian studies at the time, and much of the Russian discourse has simply not been shared with the Western world. An important fact that would influence later Russian projects. Something that is kind of beyond the scope of this video, but just saying. As Gould elaborates, Kropotkin was referencing a different discourse surrounding evolution that was not clear to his contemporaries because when he moved to the UK, he brought with him his own reflections and interpretations of that discourse that was otherwise inaccessible to the West, and so cannot be merely analyzed in a bubble. Additionally, Gould pointed out that Kropotkin's Mutual Aid is a criticism of the early Darwinist T.H. Huxley's aggressive racism and social Darwinism. Gould argues that it's not that the Russian way of analyzing evolution versus the Darwinian gladiatorial battles approach is right or wrong, but rather that they developed as a result of different landscapes. Darwin analyzed his finches in the highly competitive Galapagos Islands, while Kropotkin observed birds in the desolate lands of Siberia. It only makes sense that evolution would favor different social framings in different environments, just like the animals themselves. Returning back to the book, Gould discusses in Chapter 3 the history of the craniologists, scientists from the 19th century that believed that intelligence could be inferred from various measurements of the skull, brain, and other nervous tissues. These scientists emerged as a response to exploring the potential of Darwin's theory of evolution. As Gould explains, Darwin's work had a significant impact on the socio-political developments surrounding the sciences and how to interpret them. Evolution was more than just a scientific theory, it was a theory that had the potential to explain the origin of mankind and all life around it. This had massive social implications because it meant that more creationist interpretations of life's existence, religious or otherwise, were ruled out, and that life was not merely something to analyze across various forms, but also across times, and transforming in diversity, expression, and form. With evolution, the only thing that was ever the same was the concept of change. This has important political consequences. Now there was a scientific model to not only explain the origin of the human species, but there was even a mechanism to select inferior traits out of the gene pool. Thus the question could be asked, if evolution created this incredible human race, with natural selection crafting humans like how it does for dog breeds, then what does this mean for the future of humanity? What kind of differences could be detected to determine the potential of humanity? This led to many scientists trying to explain this strange phenomenon that they seem to all witness, that they, white men, seem to be superior to blacks, women, and other categories. Gould explains in great detail about how this not only reproduced racist operators in all of their analysis, but how their approach led to the incredibly racist assertion that scientific research implies that black people are more animal than man. To this branch of evolutionary thought, the implication was that an organism's value could be interpreted by measures of an organism. One could tell if it was the most powerful, intelligent, or other markers of what made it the best. These measurements are observations made physically measuring the body, something that could be analyzed with high precision. What could go wrong? While scientists at the time recognized that evolution had an important existential function, most were white racists who saw this function as reproducing the superiority of their own image through the text. To them, the existential function was to reinforce the reality of the white man. In a sense, it was not about the facts at all, but it was about how they are aesthetically arranged and what kind of ethics that they compose. See, to those scientists, they understood evolution as a process of reaching perfection. Instead of life just transforming, it was getting better, and there was some lagging life forms that were not as advanced as others. These scientists would argue with incredible amount of precision and sophistication that the brains of black people were not only somehow inferior, but more similar to that with apes, meaning that black people could not form sophisticated societies. Think about how that reinforces not only racist stereotypes, but the class difference between colonized, enslaved, and exploited peoples, as if it is some kind of naturalistic reality of mankind, inchangeable and woven into our genetics. Gould goes into great detail to explain that, while some of these scientists did conduct poor research, many did not, and actually had incredibly detailed and sophisticated studies. He states that studying the text of Paul Broca alone took at least a month, and he remarks on how impressed he was at the sophistication of the data. However, this doesn't take away from the fact that all of this data funneled towards his research only exists to reinforce Broca's racist preconceived views of the inferiority of black men. Similar to what we discussed earlier with the white wall of signifiance and the black holes of subjectivity, we find all these signifiers, data, being sucked into the subject, scientific racism, to form a binary machine that determines between who is human enough to be human, based on the size of their head, their gender, or race. Another faciality machine, this time directly in the image of the white man. Thus, it brings us to the question of what scientific subjectivity is and how it's produced. In his final book, Chaosmosis, Felix Guattari elaborates about how he believes that something he calls an ethico-aesthetic paradigm influences how the real work of the sciences, in his case psychotherapy, is really practiced. He points out that therapists don't just follow the rules of psychoanalysis or other techniques, but rather their breakthroughs are through the inventions of their own interactions and interpretations of the problems of patients. In particular, he emphasizes that family therapy produces artificial subjectivity by criticizing how it produces a performance of how family activities are instead of actually observing their natural interactions directly. In a way, it's a total simulacrum of family relations instead of understanding the family itself, allowing for an entire theater of psychodrama to be composed. All of this transforms the behavior of all the subjects involved by bringing notice to features that would otherwise not be observed without this contextualization. Guattari isn't just interested here in separating the subject from just the idea of the social subject and its internal subjectivity, but rather something that is produced actively at the intersection of all sorts of different fields. So if we think of the evolution example previously, the subjects of white and black men are at the intersections of functions such as humanity, skin color, genetics, national origin, history, politics, and many other complex relations. The way that we organize all of these systems produces the Ethico-Aesthetic Paradigm, the system that organizes the value of all of these ethical relationships based on aesthetic properties. Guattari asserts that this relationship will be far more significant than just the data alone, because this framing orients how we understand the subject, and produces a little cinema that reproduces its subjectivity in others. Returning to the craniologists, Gould is not just arguing that they were racist. He was arguing that the way that scientists were researching the data, made observations, and reported on their findings, they repeated the ethical and aesthetic paradigm of the racist beliefs of the scientists making the observations in the first place. These scientists, observing these patterns through their already racist lenses, organize these data points into arrangements that reinforce the reality of intellectual differences between different kinds of humans. Finally, they projected these beliefs back onto the world through their own cinema of science, a discourse that presented evolution as being in line with racist beliefs of the superiority of white men over all other life. With this new lens, we can take a look back at the film to see what the concept of intelligence is really reproducing. It's not merely reproducing how smart people are, whatever that is, but rather what Mike Judge identifies as desirable traits. He associates intelligence with high-class wealth and behavior. It reinforces the reality that the wealthy are intelligent and that they earned their right to be there through their wealth, while the poor are unintelligent and are poor because of their incompetence. The film explores these two classes as having two different evolutionary strategies. The rich class reproduces slowly and thus is overpopulated by the rapid overpopulation of the poor classes. Because Judge intersects these poor, uneducated people with stupidity, this leads to the narrative saying that stupid people rapidly mass-produce and outpopulate the so-called intelligent white minority. Finally, this develops into the long series of poor decisions feeding power up to the top of corporations to transform the world into the hellscape that is observed through the film. Despite the narrator's insistence on this particular arrangement of events, I am still skeptical of this racist claim. Even if we are to ignore the obvious issue with generations mentioned earlier, something seems fundamentally off about this conclusion. This is apparent as soon as Joe finds himself in Frito's apartment as he's watching television. The subject matter of the television is of particular interest here. Notice how it's loaded with multiple streams of content that are controlled directly with Frito's interface, allowing him to have rapid access to anything that he desires that are directly coded by the media that he consumes. Additionally, in the future, the desires that people like Frito express are completely unrepressed and highly sexually coded. Some people were complaining when this movie came out that the sexual imagery throughout the future part was too excessive, but I found it incredibly interesting. You see, in this scenario, stupidity is not just something associated with a binary relationship with class, but rather a spectrum of continually withering sense of self-awareness caused by the breakdown of repressive structures within media, while reinforcing a new society of control through its messages. In other words, instead of having to work really hard to reach your desires by having them represented through a set of repressions and thus capable of a wide variety of complex expressions, people just have direct access to it through constant access to pornography and prostitution, and so everything they enjoy is flattened down to the subject of pure sexual desire. This allows for a surface for people's desires to be easily manipulated through the media, and thus value can be predictably extracted by megacorporations. The very relationship between the primitive desires and the repressive forces that control them mediates self-awareness, and without this repression, there's no means to contextualize one's actions in any meaningful way as an individual. In fact, it is so incapacitating that it seems like most people do not understand basic concepts until it is conveyed to them through a sexual manner. They are only convinced by simple signifiers of routes to pleasure, such as sex or money, making them incredibly easy to manipulate. It seems that at least partly the loss of intelligence in this society is actually the loss of a collective sense of identity among its people caused by the breakdown of the production of their own sense of self. All while the repressions of consumption are reduced to nearly nothing, a new structure of repressions are formulated instead. Ones that concentrate power in an ambiguous state. The entire country is run by a clown show one-party political state with threats of violence being used to force populations into submission. A police force presence is everywhere and constantly forcing Joe into increasingly absurd Kafkaesque nightmares of dealing with kangaroo courts, incompetent cops, and nonsense politics. Through the use of mass media, a cop is installed in every social interface, ready to criticize every behavior outside of being an uneducated, ignorant reactionary as homosexual, whether it be explicitly announced with a slur or through suggestive hand gestures. It is as if the junction of the state, police, and their inner constructs of the family assemble to form a society of control. The real horror of this futuristic dystopia is not just that everyone is stupid, but that lack of intelligence itself appears to have created a wasteland. While some sparks of innovation are found in the future people here and there, their minds are mostly empty and devoid of content. In a way, you can compare a person's mind to an ecosystem, full of various functions and interactions to keep itself healthy, and almost all of the ecosystems in people's brains have been reduced to an empty desert with just a few bushes hanging on for dear life. One thing that the narrator fails to grasp is just the sheer extent of this catastrophe. It is not only the minds of the people who have been impacted, but the society they live in and even the environment around them has been reduced to a wasteland through a process of rapid mass extinction due to the lack of accountability for their actions. The situation is so dire that there are constant food shortages caused by the loss of knowledge for agriculture, as it is replaced by corporate slogans. Clearly, this is not just a catastrophe caused by lack of intelligence. Guattari wrote about this very kind of catastrophe in his book, The Three Ecologies. This book, published in 1989 when he was getting involved with the Greens, is a stark warning for the future about the possibility of mass worldwide extinction, not just in the world of biological ecosystems usually considered outside of human interaction, but also the ecosystems that construct our societies and even our own minds. This model was partly inspired by Gregory Bateson's cybernetic feedback machine approach to analyzing systems that Guattari and Deleuze had been inspired by and critically responded to in the past. Side note, it's extremely funny to me that Deleuze and Guattari accused Bateson of being a dolphin fed in Anti-Oedipus. Yeah, I'm not kidding. In my research, I discovered that he was the director of that dolphin communication research facility that was funded by the government. And if you're thinking about that one, yeah, it's that one. Same one. Yep. Anyways, building off of this cybernetic inspiration, think of all of the interconnected relations between language, art, meanings, and life that exists around us. This is what he believes is at risk of extinction, besides just mere species. Guattari wastes no time to discuss the problem, beginning the book with, "The Earth is undergoing a period of intense techno-scientific transformations. If no remedy is found, the ecological disequilibrium this has generated will ultimately threaten the continuation of life on this planet's surface. Alongside these upheavals, human modes of life, both individual and collective, are progressively deteriorating. Kinship networks tend to be reduced to a bare minimum. Domestic life is being poisoned by the gangrene of mass media consumption. Family and married life are frequently ossified by a sort of standardization of behavior, and neighborhood relations are generally reduced to their meanest expression. It is the relationship between subjectivity and its exteriority that is compromised in this way, in a sort of general movement of implosion and regressive infantilization. Otherness tends to lose all of its asperity." What Guattari is really stressing here is that all of the consequences that are caused by this destruction of the ecologies lined out above is caused by a fundamental breakdown between our inner worlds, subjectivity, and how they interact with the outside world, its exteriority. Essentially, many of the connections between ourselves, the environment, our position in society are dissolving rapidly because of the proliferation of some kind of toxic algae spreading in our minds and media, leading to the breakdown of our world and the extinction of many different kinds of subjectivity. Guattari emphasizes that this is not just a matter of ecological destruction caused by pollution or habitat loss, but rather larger processes deeply intersecting with the spread of something he calls integrated world capitalism. A transition away from the industrial production of things and towards a production of signs, signifiers, and opinion. And to him, the effects of this process are spreading across every vector in our lives. Just as monstrous and mutant algae invade the lagoon of Venice, so our television screens are populated, saturated by degenerate images and statements. In the field of social ecology, men like Donald Trump are permitted to proliferate freely, like another species of algae, taking over entire districts of New York and Atlantic City. He redevelops by raising rents, therefore driving out tens of thousands of poor families, most of whom are condemned to homelessness, becoming the equivalent of the dead fish of environmental ecology. Further proliferation is evident in the savage deterritorialization of the Third World, which simultaneously affects the cultural texture of its populations, its habitat, its immune systems, climate, etc. Child labor is another disaster of social ecology. It has actually become more prevalent now than it was in the 19th century. How do we regain control of such an auto-destructive and potentially catastrophic situation? Analyzing this question requires conceiving of a model to analyze the problem in the first place. Unlike a lot of his other work, where he insists on a metaphysics of constant change and emerging ruptures in patterns and exceptions to assumptions, he instead proposes a structural model between three registers that he identifies to analyze the world through: the environment, the social interactions between people, and the people's subjectivity themselves. This is what he calls an ethico-political articulation. Think of it as a kind of ethico-aesthetic paradigm focused on political framing that allows him to explore the questions of how these interactions occur and what can be done to minimize the impact of this extinction event. Additionally, he emphasizes that any approach to try to solve these issues must not only consider the macro-political scale of politics, but also the microscopic relations of things like desires and the individual decisions that people ultimately make. In other words, he is using a specific metamodelization to understand a problem from a new lens. A common misconception about Guattari is that he advocated for no structure, but clearly the Three Ecologies demonstrates otherwise. Instead, he advocates for useful structures that are changed as the conditions around them change. Like how Guattari describes in the Three Ecologies, we can see that the future world is devastated by a decentralization of any kind of political identity. Hundreds of years before the events of the future parts of the film, the government slowly sold off all of its power to various corporate forces, causing the transition of political power to totalitize around an international capitalist machine. Labor relations were reduced to a fine dust centuries ago. An end result of this is the homogenization of all the land shown in the future. Features are nearly indistinguishable and are marked by miles and miles of ghettos separated by various corporate islands, such as the scale of the massive Costco. In this world, almost all interactions appear to be reduced into transactions, something that Rita takes advantage of throughout the movie, all while this is still being focused within the imperial core of the United States. It's never mentioned or explored what the conditions of people impacted by this absurd nation's potential military conquest used to continue to fuel this trash empire, a world or people clearly unable to take care of themselves, a fact that reflects white America's attitude towards the illegal invasion of Iraq occurring at the time quite clearly. However, Guattari is not simply overcome with defeat. If anything, he is trying to organize readers into a stand against this process and discuss possible political solutions to it. This lens of the Three Ecologies gives a scaffolding to hang the discussion from so it can make a bit more sense. His concerns are wide, varied, and encompass many complex relations, but his key goal is to construct ecosophy through this model, ways of meta-modeling these ecologies and their intersections in new ways. Instead of merely trying to describe what is happening now, Guattari is interested in using these models to create new possibilities for the future, essentially radically rearranging our relations to try to fight back against this problem of proliferating transition towards meaningless signs taking over our lives and robbing us of our intelligence. Throughout the book, Guattari emphasizes the importance of acknowledging every level of development across this redesign of how we understand reality, To Felix, transcribing everything into one meta-model actually replicates the same binary categorization that we described earlier regarding faciality, where things are sorted into an X or a Y. But if we understand this problem as many systems interacting on different locales with different strata, we can recognize not only how much more complex the problem is, but also prevent ourselves from applying a rigid mask to limit what possibilities are actually available to us. To better understand this, let's look a little closer into understanding how Guattari's model of multiplicity and subjectivity actually works. Instead of constructing subjectivity around the concept of a subject, which is encoded in one specific semiotic set of rules, he instead constructs subjectivity around an intersection of various abstract machines that produce the subject at a particular place in space and time. You can think of the situation as a bunch of fields that exist in the world. A field for humanness, a field for gender, a field for living in a particular city, a field for all sorts of other things. And where all these fields intersect in a particular location leads to the production of a particular subjectivity. This is why with Guattari, subjectivity is not dependent on language. To him, the unconscious does not work like a language and does not necessitate it. Instead, it is produced through the coupling of multiple machines at a particular junction. In the Three Ecologies, he further states, "Rather than speak of the subject, we should perhaps speak of the components of subjectification, each working more or less on its own. This would lead us necessarily to re-examine the relationship between the concepts of the individual and subjectivity, and, above all, to make a clear distinction between the two. Vectors of subjectification do not necessarily pass through the individual, which in reality appears to be something like a terminal for processes that involve human groups, socioeconomic ensembles, data processing machines, etc. Therefore, interiority establishes itself at the crossroads of multiple components, each relatively autonomous in relation to the other, and if need be, in open conflict." What Guattari is interested then with his politics concerns what occurs at the intersection of various abstract machines. At these boundaries, it becomes unclear how to determine which concern is part of which abstract machine. For example, is an issue with how black women are treated an issue of women or an issue of blackness? In America, a similar concept called intersectionality grew popular. Conceived by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, it aims to describe the relations between systematic oppression and the intersection of minority marginalization through a model that emphasizes the production of a new subject at the intersection of different social identities, especially within the legal context. This idea partly found its roots in the Boston-based Combahee River Collective, a black feminist group that tried to capture gaps caused by this very problem with both feminism and blackness being overcoded by dominant discourses with whiteness and masculinity respectively, as well as cases where legally the intersectional identity of black women was not recognized as unique by the courts, leading to unfair judgments. To Crenshaw, at these intersections, a new discourse is produced that allows for a space for black women and other kinds of intersectional identities to emerge. In comparison, however, Guattari emphasizes that at this intersection, the most important parts of which are asignifying and are not represented by any specific external discussion, there are ruptures in dominating mass-produced modes of subjectivity that can be produced. You can think of these ruptures as disturbances in the assembly line of this mass media sign production that causes people to not think in the same way anymore, and decouple them somewhat from this productive force for the masses, thus over time breaking down and transforming the machines mass-producing this propaganda, and allowing people to gain control of their own production again, media, labor, or otherwise. Understanding this is key to understanding Guattari's Ecosophical project. With all of this in back pocket, let's now return to the film. Joe is confronted with an ethical dilemma. He believes that there is a functioning time machine that can bring him back to 2005 where he belongs. However, he feels bad for the people after everything he's been through because he realizes that they really are suffering and that all the nonsense that he had to deal with was part of a larger system that is struggling to stay alive during mass extinction. After all, what other reason could there even be for a society of stupid people who repeatedly capture him, locking him up for nonsense crimes, and then immediately after declaring him the most intelligent person in the world and forcing him into high-level political office? He realizes that he is stuck in a mental breakdown of the society and feels some ethical duty to sort it out. He is tasked with figuring out how to stop the famine caused by the lack of crop yields. He discovers fairly quickly that the problem is actually quite simple. They're giving the plants Brondo, an electrolyte drink, simply because the branding slogan implies that electrolytes are what they crave. Instead, he suggests that water should be used, something that's only used for toilets and disposal. The people are shocked because he is suggesting using water, which is seen as unclean and unfit for consumption, on the plants for their food, but he pressures them into trying it. Ironically enough, the electrolytes cause the soil to become too heavily covered in salts, interfering with plant growth, but this could not be understood by the people because of their lack of connection to the outside world. While the situation may have seemed simple, Joe forgot that he lives in a world almost completely automated by signs. In a way, these problems are caused by society functioning more like a massive signal transaction calculator than a relationship with reality. Unfortunately for Joe, the calculations did not initially result in his favor. As a result of Joe's actions, the stocks for Brondo dropped to practically zero rapidly, eliminating a huge amount of the workforce overnight. This leads to a riot aimed at punishing Joe for disturbing the stability of this society, making them too impatient to actually see if the plants can actually grow. Joe struggles to comprehend that he lives in a world nearly completely automated by signs, and that the people are so alienated from their exteriority that they cannot comprehend this rupture in their worldview. This rupture comes with a lot of scary signs being produced, like job loss, threats of conspiracy, and potentially the continuation of famine. Compare this incompetence to Rita, who takes advantage of Johns throughout the film until she's eventually caught up by the incompetent police force, and later is able to manipulate people in exchange for promises of sex and money. This is all coalescing in a massive spectacle at the climax of the film in the form of rehabilitation. Fittingly, with over-the-top phallic tanks designed to not merely kill Joe publicly, but to transform his death into a spectacle of itself, to reconstruct his public humiliation into a sign, replicated through the chatter of these stupid humans, encoding new meanings throughout society beyond Joe's will to power, destined to be reduced to nothing more than just another signifier. But that's not actually what happens, is it? What allows Joe to overcome any of this linguistic oppression? Simple. He continually finds ways through the cracks. As he adapts more and more towards this world of shallow signifiers passing through space, he is able to create a new subjectivity that makes him much more unpredictable to even heavily armed police, military, and gladiators. Not only does he continually outsmart them to avoid being killed, but he and Rita actively work together to produce new realities through first a microphone, amplifying a voice through the stadium, and finally, in the nick of time, video footage of plants growing after being given water. This break through the machines that mass-produce the signifiers to the society creates a new surface for new possibilities to emerge, because nobody who saw the footage can deny that they saw the plants growing. Everything changes, and the people see a new way out of the situation, and there's a happy ending in all that. Well, except for the fact where Joe doesn't actually get to go back in time because he didn't consider the fact that the people were too stupid to know that the time machine doesn't refer to a ride named the time machine. Yep, that sucks, buddy. But that's it, right? So, does this mean that Idiocracy is actually an ecosophical masterpiece or something? Well, not really. We can't forget about its horribly eugenicist premise to begin with. But something criticized far less about this film is actually Joe's way of trying to make stupid people smart again. See, the situation is not really as simple as what Joe seems to suggest at the end of the film, that we should just understand how to read and write books again, and that we need to understand what communication means. This is really just the first step. What we really need moving forward is a new way of rearranging the problem that causes us to not replicate the same issues again. Does this film really achieve this transformation by the end of the movie if it's still concerned about who is having how many babies? Does it really escape the problem of meaninglessness without radically reorganizing from just a mere critique of capitalism towards an active attempt towards its disassembly, as Guattari ponders near the end of the Three Ecologies? A new ecosophy, at once applied in theoretical, ethico-political, and aesthetic, would have to move away from old forms of political, religious, and associative commitment. Rather than being a discipline of refolding on interiority or a simple renewal of earlier forms of militancy, it will be a multifaceted movement, deploying agencies and dispositives that will simultaneously analyze and produce subjectivity. A collective and individual subjectivity that completely exceeds the limits of individualization, stagnation, identificatory closure, and will instead open itself upon its sides to the socius, but also to the machinic phylum, to techno-scientific universes of reference, to aesthetic worlds, as well as to new pre-personal understanding of time, of the body, of sexuality. A subjectivity of re-singularization that can meet head-on the encounter with the finitude of desire, pain, and death.